Hey, Kingdom Workers. Welcome to Christ at Work, a podcast inspiring Christ followers to live out the kingdom's purposes in their workplaces. I'm your host, Matt Templeton. On today's episode, I interview Haro Setian. Haro's a real estate entrepreneur and business leader in Greenville, South Carolina. He's a significant interview for me because since I've known him, he's always been someone leading out and practicing the ways of Christ in his everyday work and encouraging others to do the same. In fact, he's pushed me in this area, and I think he's a great guy to emulate. Here's Haro. So obviously, the Christ at Work podcast is we're hearing stories and we're interviewing people who are actively pursuing bringing the kingdom into the workplace. I remember even like 8, 9, 10 years ago, people were telling me, you've got to meet Haro. He talks about these same things you talk about. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, yeah, I'd love to meet Haro sometime. And I think we met maybe 8 or 9 years ago around the idea of business as mission, or I think what was the Jeff Van Duzer book that we read early on?
Why Business Matters to God.
Why Business Matters to God. Like just this idea that the Lord is involved in our work. And I think we all started to realize these things are not divided, but then how do you actually integrate them? So it's not that they're not actually separate, but then how do we make it really intentional? It's not just that I'm an ethical person or a moral person, or, you know, like our friends at Praxis do a great job of making startups focused on things that matter in the kingdom. But then how do we go even beyond that into spiritual practices and evangelizing our coworkers and caring about our clients in a way? And so anyway, we're gonna talk about that today, but I'd love for you to introduce yourself. What do you do? What's your business? Yeah, tell us the basics.
Yeah, the short story is my name's Haro Setian. I was born in Boston. I live in South Carolina. I have a wife and 3 children, and I own a couple of real estate companies, slightly different in the clientele that they serve. I'm currently on sabbatical, so you got me at a very rested and relaxed point in my life.
Awesome. And so what is your role in those businesses when you're not on sabbatical?
In one, I'm the majority investor and really just don't have a lot that I have to functionally do on a regular basis other than chime in when we have investor in meetings. And then the other one, I function as I think in the past I've functioned as a manager and the founder, CEO, visionary leader, and I've learned to start separating those roles, and I'm really good at one and I'm really terrible at the other. Or I mean, not really terrible. I don't give myself enough credit. I'm there are lots of people that could do that better than me.
So when you come back from sabbatical, what will be your role? Maybe that's a little bit of a rabbit trail, but
that's a good question. I don't know. I think I'm inquiring of the Lord on one hand. On the other hand, the leaders that have been essentially responsible for the operation and maintenance of the business, that specific business, the one I spent most of my time in, I'm really going to ask them, like, hey, how best can I be used and serve here? And coupled with, I think there's some things that for me are going to be turned into maybe red lines or maybe realizations that I've had that I just, hey, I don't want to do that or be involved in that way any longer. And whatever the ramification of that is, that's okay with me.
Well, maybe we'll unpack a little bit more of that later. In the meantime, before you went on sabbatical, what ways were you making your business, or how did you sort of influence your business to this direction of, I want it to be kingdom focused, or I want it to be Christ at the center? What were some of the ways that looked like a kingdom focused business?
Sometimes I feel like I'm hobbling around in the dark to make that happen. And in other ways, like I have things that I can wrap my hands around and point to it. Of course, we're in the residential real estate industry. And one of the things that we've come to believe is that we need to have as a family, we need to have a regular practice of Sabbath. And to me, the automatic extension of that is that Sabbath would be available to the people in our business. So we do our best to help our people through company structure, as well as just encouragement to honor at least one day of the week as separate, as different, as they don't have to work. So we don't, on Sundays, no one has access to leads, even though leads come in. We're not, it's a big part of a real estate sales business is leads, but those leads will be followed up with on Monday. We don't We don't do any open houses. And then we encourage our people to take the day off. Another thing that we've always done is we have a half-hour huddle every morning. And traditionally, we've set apart Thursdays as either prayer or some sort of scriptural focus to help develop the soul and the whole person. I think I take a little bit of my cues from Jeff Van Duzer in that, if he, in his book, posits that if we could deduce a purpose for business from God and from Scripture, God doesn't say like, "Hey, these are the purposes of business," but it would be to make goods and services that would make people better off, help them thrive in all ways, like all spiritually, financially, physically, emotionally, spiritually, all of the ways that matter. Now our particular service or product maybe just focused on one of those, but as much as we can make other people better off, that's what we ought to be doing in our the narrow lane that is any one of our businesses. And then the second purpose would be to create a workplace that draws out the best from the people that work there, so that they're, I don't want to use the word self-actualization, but it's kind of a self-actualization thing of helping them to understand who they are in Jesus, their unique gifts and talents, and developing those and bringing those to bear and exploring those. So those two things have been kind of like how I see the kingdom at work within the business. And so what I realized is that even in the early years, I had a heart for this, but I was a very egocentric, fear-driven person in the way I actually ran my business. And in the more recent years, some of that stuff has, and God's really done a lot of work on me even during sabbatical as to like how to not have my identity attached to the work, to this relative success or unsuccess, whatever that may be, not to have my identity attached to that. And I think that would free me up even more. In the past, it was, how do we unleash people to be their true selves? And I think that was more of an intellectual exercise in the past. And I believe that God's taken me on a journey of understanding the depth of what that can mean for people, whether it's psychological or emotional work that needs to be done, or even recently I've had more understanding and more enlightenment around just even physical healing. And I'm looking forward to the future and how God unpacks that and how that comes to bear in the workplace. But how do we bring the kingdom, which is abundance, and the most like, it's unnatural for people to be in pain or in shame or afraid or hurt or physically have a malady. So how do I bring the natural of the kingdom, which is God's intention and our what we're partnering with him on, how to bring the fullness of that into what I'm doing every day is probably a journey I'll be on the rest of my life.
I want to unpack that idea of the kingdom more, because you mentioned several things that if somebody's just getting introduced to this idea, maybe they've thought about faith at work or Christ at work or evangelizing their coworkers, but the idea that all of our work of producing goods and services that serve other people and drawing out the best in people, and that the kingdom is actually more than just you should believe in Jesus and be saved, although it's not less than that. This is a much bigger view. And so unpack that idea of what is the kingdom and why we use these phrases. And I think some people probably think this is a whole new idea to me. I've never thought about this wide view of God's purposes.
Well, I think this is a developing set of thoughts for me, and you and I have talked about this a little bit before, but I think it's really helpful if we do away with the word salvation and saved, because I think those have just become Christianese and Christian lingo such that we don't even know what we're talking about. Saved from what? Salvation from what? And what's really helpful is to think about it in terms of, and the words that are translated for saved could be translated this way as well. From my understanding, I'm not a theological expert, but healing and restoration and being made whole, that, like, it is our job to bring that into the world, bring wholeness and restoration and healing, whether that's physical healing, spiritual healing, emotional healing. So I think sometimes we just have this really narrow view of this thing called salvation. It really just becomes an intellectual exercise of like, you will be saved if you believe the right things. And I don't think that's exactly what Jesus meant or the New Testament writers meant. In fact, you can look at it all throughout the scriptures. There's all sorts of behavioral moving from less whole to more whole that happens throughout the New Testament. You know, sometimes we say saved. Saved from what? Saved from hell. You know, I was reading the book of Acts the other day. I read it in 2 sittings. Yeah. Did you know that hell wasn't even mentioned in the book of Acts? I was just there's like 4 or 5 things I noticed as I was reading through it, and like the concept of hell wasn't even mentioned in the book of Acts. It was a lot of healing and a lot of healing. It's pretty much what happens as the disciples or apostles. Even apostles is kind of a weird word because it has no current meaning for us in our culture other than apostles of Jesus. So like it's a self-referential word which doesn't carry any weight really. So more of like, hey, the apprentices of Jesus as they went along the way. I mean, these were kind of a unique group of apprentices, but apostle means sent ones. So these are the ones that are sent out to spread this good news. And what is the good news? That healing is here and wholeness is here, and you don't have to live with the lies and the shame and the guilt that you've been carrying. So, how do we bring that into our businesses? It's actually a little bit refreshing to think about it that way because I said this before, but I think I was really bad at evangelism or witnessing in the past because it was mostly about winning people to my side intellectually, and that's kind of an exhausting task, and I don't feel up to it, or I didn't feel up to it. Like, can I make the intellectual argument so good that you can't, like, that you're like, oh, touche, I'll be a Jesus follower. And that's not what we see in Acts or in the Gospels, but it's bringing wholeness. And sometimes it's not even about preaching. Sometimes it's just like, let's heal these people. And maybe then we'll get to the preaching later, which is fascinating when you actually read the word that's what happens on a regular basis. So, anyway, back to the question, which is bringing this in the workplace. It should just be a natural outflow of who we are becoming. We're being healed, we bring healing. As we're being restored, that flows out of us and helps other people move along the path to restoration. And so if it's in your workplace, those are people you spend 8 hours a day with 5 days a week, arguably more than just about anybody.
Right. And I often think of evangelism in the context of 2 Corinthians 5, where it gives this idea of we're ambassadors and we're saying, come back to God, be reconciled to God. And that's so that they can have life with God again. Like this was the life you were supposed to have. The reconciliation is you have this broken relationship, but when you come back into relationship with God, he will restore the abundant life, the life that you were meant to live. Right. And some of that is a process of restoring. And some of that is immediate. You start to experience the new life. And then looking forward to the eternity of that life that just continues on, right? We start now, it gets better and better, and then it moves into eternity. But it's a relationship with God where we experience the life it was meant. So what things from the beginning were life supposed to be like? What was life supposed to be like before the fall? You know, we're being restored to this, walking with God in relationship while we do work. And I think there's a concept out of Genesis, right? That work as worship, or work is worship, or work and worship simultaneously, like that they're not separate. We're actually doing these things in relationship with God for his glory as a very relational aspect of our livelihood, of our life.
I mean, if you go back to Genesis 1 or 2, one of those two, before the fall, God indicated and commanded humans to be his partners. He gave the raw material of creation, and they said, hey, he said, now you have dominion over it. Like, how many of us are willing to have that kind of conversation with subordinates, if you will, beings that we've created? But that's exactly what God does, and he partners with us. And I mean, in some sense, I heard it said recently, who does the work of evangelism? Not God, we do. Like, we're the ones. So there's this partnership in creating the reality that God's after, that he's welcoming us, like we his created ones are welcomed into that to carry that out. So that's that shows up in how we work. And the running a kingdom business, like in the beginning it could look like one thing, but as you grow and mature in your understanding of who God is, like that's going to look very, very different in 20, 10, 20, 30, 40 years than it does today.
Well, and just to put a bow on the idea of evangelism, it's actually, we're proclaiming the good news of the kingdom. God is reconciling us back to himself. The kingdom is at hand. We can live the restored life back in relationship with God. Now, what does the restored life look like, right? That's the evangelism, is Jesus's death and resurrection provides a way to be back in relationship with God. And then all this healing and wholeness and the goodness, all the ethics of the kingdom that are coming and both spreading in the current world and also eventually will be replaced when Jesus has his last triumph over evil. All of that is what we're looking forward to. And I always say we're trying to remove ourselves from the empire, right? The kingdom of this world. We're trying to step out, unplug from the empire and plug into how does the kingdom operate? And so it's a spiritual reality coming real here. But our evangelism is, hey, the kingdom is at hand. This is repent and believe. This is good news that we're being reconciled back to our creator. Because you were made, we should be asking, what is my purpose? What am I here for? What did my creator make me for? And then we spend the rest of our lives until we figure out exactly, maybe immediately figure that out, but also spend the rest of our journey saying, Lord, what have you made me for? What am I supposed to be doing? What does this look like? And then experience the joy that comes from that. Going back to the
one
go ahead.
thing that something you said sparked in my mind is, I think it might be helpful for people, and I know I was in this place for many years of my life, of thinking that the kingdom is some future thing that happens out in the distance. And if you read the scripture, that's not the case. Like in Mark 2, to proclaim, I'm not going to quote it right, but like proclaiming the kingdom is here, the kingdom is at hand, it's now. And so while there is in scripture clear evidence of there being a new heavens and a new earth at some point in the future, the unfolding of that kingdom is happening now. And then there will be a culmination in the future. However, part of bringing that to bear now.
So going back to some of the tactical, when you're having Thursday prayer, you're not working on Sundays or having Sabbath for your employees, are you explaining to them what the importance of this is? Or is it kind of like Chick-fil-A where you say, hey, we want you to have time with your family on Sunday, so take off on Sunday? Like, what's the dialogue? And are these all believers? Are they unbelievers? What's the dialogue with the people in your business
I
around
think
this?
everyone's, believer, unbeliever, I think everyone's on a journey. It's pretty hard to interview with our company and join us without knowing that that's what we're about. So there's at least when I'm interviewing someone, I tell them you don't have to believe the way we do to work here. That's illegal. However, you do have to have a posture of respect and honor for that. So yeah, I explain what it's all about, how each one interprets it for themselves is, or to which they understand it might be different. But yeah, I'm very clear, I'm very open. There are some specific things you can do like I'm doing, but then there's also how we treat people on a day-to-day basis. For me, I was actually talking to my assistant the other day because there's some things I need to keep up with while I'm on sabbatical. And one of our one of our people that's been with us many years, her mother's on hospice and will pass away soon. So she's out of the office. At the size that our company is at currently, at least in the way that I understand it, it would be wise for us to continue to grow so that we can introduce redundancies, because this person on our team was saying, hey, I can work even though I'm not in the office. And I don't want her to have to think about that. So I want for the company to grow in size so that we can have redundancies in the system. And in my mind, those redundancies would be a way to serve the people that right now are the only ones that can do what they do. Obviously, cross training helps as well, but that's never as good as if there's two people doing the same role. So that's another example. I think I mentioned how you deal with people.
Did you start telling people in the interview process or making these things true about your business from the very beginning? Was there a moment, like even inside of your business, where you're like, this isn't a very kingdom-based business, I should make this more intentional? Like, I mean, obviously it grows over time, but was this an intention you had from the beginning when you started this, or was it something that you had to come to, like a fork in the road, and you said, we've got to proclaim that we are believers, and this is what we believe is
No,
true?
that was an intention from the beginning, mostly because in my 20s, the person that I worked for and with was a really good example in trying. It was limited, not limited. I think he did the best he could with what he knew at that time and was passionate about, like, there was no separation of church and state with him, sacred and secular. That didn't exist. It was all holy ground. And he would say, I felt as called to running a business as any pastor feels to running a church. And so I
That's
learned from him, and that's what I started doing right from the early days. Even though it looks a whole lot different, I'm much more mature now. Back then, I was much less mature. But yeah, it was from the beginning.
there's a whole gamut of people, right? There's the people that are workers inside of somebody else's business. There's the people who are leaders inside of a business. Maybe they've got some autonomy. And then there's people that have a lot of autonomy, like yourself, that can design their business around this. How would you encourage either entrepreneurs or other leaders to cultivate this if they haven't started it from the beginning that way? Because I know in my world, I've been fearful in the past of, how do I change the dynamic when we've kind of been going along and people know I'm a Christian, but they don't necessarily, I'm not asking them to pray with me. I'm not putting that in my mission statement. We haven't made this about these things in the past. Have you, and you haven't obviously done this, but what is your thinking around making that pivot?
I would say stay away from Christianese in this process. That was the first thing that came to mind. Like, even when you said pray, because in Western culture, we don't actually pray to anyone else but God. So that if this person doesn't have any concept or even an anti concept of God, then it could sound, it could become off putting or become a word that creates separation. So what I'm really looking for is how can I have joyful connection with these people? And so maybe it's, let's just talk to God, and even if the word God is triggering, there's lots of ways to God can handle it if you don't use the word God. And you know what you mean, and you're making it palatable for someone else to hear. That's like an extreme example. I think to seek out, I think the first step would be talk to God about it. What does He want you to do? And then seek out other believers, other community that are working this out themselves, whether that's locally or nationally, and just hear different ideas and ways other people have made the switch. I don't know if that's the right word, but like they're started moving their business in that direction. If there's clearly sinful things that aren't helpful, obviously doing away with those. Are there any business practices that are clear violations of scriptural principles? That's an easy place to clean up. Is there anyone that you need to forgive? I know as a business owner, man, I had to do a lot of work with bitterness for past employees or team members, and it's so easy to carry a grudge or be bitter. And even today there was something that came up. I saw on Venmo, I was paying someone on Venmo, and then I saw an ex team member on Venmo paying someone, and I felt something in my heart of like some antipathy towards them. And I was like, that was like God putting His finger on that. I was like, hey, I just really need to release her and just forgive and bless her. And she's a child of God. She's been made in His image, and whatever happened in the past, there's my side, there's her side, there's the right side, and I don't want to carry that any longer. Because clearly it was still in my heart, because it was like a little tingle came up. And so I think there's that too. Like, there's that hard emotional work that people have to do. I actually sat down at one point about a year ago in my morning time and wrote down the names of all these people in my business that I had felt hurt by or slighted by over the years. And I had to, like, Father, I forgive them, I release them, I bless them. I mean, those are some thoughts that are coming to mind right now for some of the work that, because what's Jesus's goal for us is to become, or God's goal is to become a more loving person and a more compassionate person. And so I think to cut away these calluses of bitterness and hate is let beautiful, fresh, new pink flesh in those places, to use an analogy, which was pretty, I don't know if that was beautiful or not.
Well, I think, yeah, I think of, I mean, this is really helpful to me, even as I'm thinking about this. My perception of believers who are Christians who are struggling with this are saying, I just got to get more evangelism out. I got to do more. I got to make sure I'm telling people about Jesus, which certainly I want to tell people about Jesus. I want to tell people about the kingdom. I want them to experience the wholeness and the health. But part of that is actually the first work of, am I being like Jesus? And for us to not just say personally, how am I being like Jesus in my personal relationships, but where am I believing the lie? Where have I taken on the empire's ethics and I'm still living in these like, well, that person wronged me, so I've got bitterness towards them. Like that's maybe a more obvious one. Like you said, some of the other things where it's like other violations of scripture where the empire says I can operate my business this way, but the kingdom would say that's not how Jesus would operate. Like I often ask myself, how would Jesus operate this business if it was his? Would he treat that person that way? Would he ask this question? Would he how would he operate? And I think compassion and love is a really important thing. I think also purity, holiness, specifically emphasizing truth and not falsehood. But I think this is really important, specifically in business. I think the way that we cut people off, or that we fire, or that people leave us, and then we feel like, I think that aspect of bitterness really prevents us from having effective businesses in the spiritual world. So I think that's a good thing, is like, what is the work I need to do if I'm making this shift? What's the work I need to do so that if somebody looked at my business, they would say, I can see the marks of Jesus on that business or on that person's life and how they operate in business. And then it's much easier to proclaim the goodness of God if that's what marks, all of our life.
Which, and that's why I think the hard internal work is really the key. It'll pour out if you have to do the hard work of going through, and you might have to make amends for people you've wronged, and you might have to seek forgiveness and all that kind of stuff. That's the
Mm,
way the kingdom starts showing up, is that I'm not a person that has to self-protect and self-promote. I can come to you and I can say, you know what, I did the wrong thing and forgive me. That will do more than any program.
totally. I heard someone say recently, in a world that doesn't know how to reconcile relationships, ask for forgiveness, be wrong, modeling a redemptive culture, creating redemptive culture, both in our relationships, in our businesses, in the places when we say, forgive me, these are even opportunities to explain why are you coming to me and saying this? The Lord convicted me. I feel this is the way of Jesus. This is the way of the kingdom. Like helping people to understand that the reason I'm doing this is because I believe that the goodness of the kingdom will actually cause flourishing and joy. And so I have to humble myself and do what Jesus asked me to do, which is ask for your
Yeah.
forgiveness. And that modeling of the redemptive culture, even if it's not directly tied back to Jesus and the kingdom, is so it's salt and light in a very dark world. And they're feeling the physical and spiritual effects of the darkness that comes from no redemption, no restoration, no reconciliation, no forgiveness. I just constantly have bitterness towards other people. Like it's literally killing people. And so then to put the salt on the light and the joy on, this is painful, but this humility, this forgiveness produces so much life. I think it's beautiful. It's hard, but it's beautiful.
Another thought I had was just not responding in kind, because there's all the time where a vendor, a supplier, a former coworker, et cetera, a present coworker, or something does something unintentionally or intentionally wrong you, and to not respond in kind, but like if someone asks you to walk a mile, walk with them too. Like, I see your mile. I see you clearly need this. You clearly need my help. This is you taking advantage of me and you taking advantage of your whatever. But you know what? You need this. So let's do more. And responding to that with generosity and love and compassion, that's the way of the kingdom.
Well, and the thing I've had to continue to work on, and I don't even feel like I have it down yet. But the basis for that is actually a trust that the Lord is my provider. The Lord is the one that takes care of me. So this person wronging me isn't going to destroy my livelihood, isn't going to destroy, like, the Lord's provision trumps whatever sacrifice I'm called to. And my ability to sacrifice in this moment is not me giving up. But I often think, like, I'm giving up income, I'm giving up my way, I'm giving up, like, yes, you are laying down your life and you're joining in Christ's sacrifice for the benefit of this other person, and demonstrating that is actually doing spiritual work. And hopefully that is actually something that might move this person to recognizing they need the Lord, that this is actually a better way, that this is the kingdom.
Yeah. And it's important to be able to keep this heart with amongst yourself, is to have community. I think at the very least is to have a local community of believers that may not, I mean, they may or may not be in the same station of life as you are, but can help you see your blind spots, where you're honest and vulnerable and truth telling with them. They see, like, hey, I'm afraid of this situation, whatever the thing may be, or I got some anxiety about this, and you can be honest about that and let people speak into your life. And then also on top of that, what's been really helpful for me, I don't know that it's commanded by the scriptures, but to have other people that I'm close with that follow Jesus, that are in similar positions of business as myself, and can help me think about some of these business issues in a way that another follower of Jesus would think of them.
Well, and that's what's so hard if you don't have that, because the empire pulls you back in and they say, well, you obviously were misled there for a second. Come back and focus on these things about success and money and your self-worth in your business and your work, and you come back to our way. And it's easy to be like, oh yeah, I should go focus on that again, instead of prioritizing what I think the Lord is calling me to, or prioritizing what I think the kingdom is saying. And because there's even some laying down of your life in there, as 100% laying down of your life in choosing things of the kingdom. And laying down of my life is so that I can find it, right? Is I could make more money if I would do these things the empire is telling me to do. I could have more status, more fame. I could feel more important from a self-worth kind of perspective. More people might like me. I'm going to get all these benefits from operating in the empire, and the kingdom saying, lay down that life so that you'll find your real life. And without people to remind me, I might say, I haven't quite experienced all the real life. This other life seems a little bit more enjoyable. I think I'm going to go back to really focusing on my sales numbers and trying to drive those as high as I possibly can, right? Anyway, whatever the example is, but I do think we need a community. So, I mean, obviously you sort of made your own community. Where do you think believers should find that community of other people in work and business?
I mean,
How would you go about
I would
finding it?
start with your local church and see who else there is on this path, and then, if one's running a business, which is the space I live in, just look for, there's gatherings of stuff like this. I mean, everything from something as simple as, not simple, but like C12, which is Christian business leaders, and they get together, I think, once a month. And then there's other resources. There's books, and there's conferences, and Praxis, which you referenced earlier today, has, founders and startups and investors and philanthropists. And then The Gathering, I don't know if you've heard of The Gathering. I think I told you about it recently. But that's for people who are in the position of, they're wealthy and they can give a lot, but it's believing givers that obviously they got to the position where they can give for some reason. So they may be in a similar station of life, or maybe 10 steps ahead, and can be mentors, if you will. But that, I would seek out that community for sure. But the thing that you mentioned, these idols or attachments or motivations, like, I want to make money, or I want success, I want to be well thought of, I want to be, I think the hard work, sometimes we're asked to, hey, turn away from wanting to make a lot of money. Okay, that's that's good, but another level of that is, why do you want to make a lot of money? What is the underlying belief that's driving that? Is there a fear? Is there a concern? I know for me, there was concern and worry, and I didn't want to feel some of the pain I had felt earlier in my life when we were not very well to do family. And so that led me to a belief of God's not good. and he's not going to take care of me. So I'm the one on the hook. So that's what created my drive. So I think that, again, so much of this stuff is the hard work of renouncing those beliefs. And repent means to change your mind, to change the way you think. So you can initially change your mind and renounce the belief, but then sometimes it creeps in ways unawares. Like, you didn't know that that's what's driving how I make that decision. Like, for instance, I've gotten 2 speeding tickets recently, and my license is in danger of being suspended for points. And I just had to ask myself, what's the underlying thing here? What is God laying his finger on? And there's a couple of things. One is hurry. Why am I in a hurry? Really, you can't make yourself get somewhere that much faster by speeding. Maybe a little bit faster, but part of that is just like you need to order your day better. But then there's an obedience there too, like obey the authorities that God's given you. And obedience is a word and a concept that God's brought up over the last year or so for me. And it's just not a way, like, because my parents divorced and I really have a dad in the house, and my mom was kind of challenged in her ability to be a leader. For me as a child, obedience is not something there's not a common, it's just not in my parlance. But God seems to keep bringing it back over the last couple of years in different ways. Of, are you going to obey? Are you going to be a man under authority, as we read in the scripture? And even Jesus put himself under God's authority, God the Father's authority, when he became human. So I think the internal work works itself out, and then I would talk about it with the people at your company. And I mean, if you have relationships, those things will just pour themselves out. I have a hard time being two different people. So if something's going on in my life, like, I don't not talk about it with these people because those are my work people and these are my personal people. I'm not good at a double life. So I just talk about it.
Totally. Yeah. I think that's a great point is, people ask us all the time, how are you? What's going on in your world? What's going on in your life? And so then to just give them a formulaic answer, fine, good, weather's good, right? Whatever those answers are, to actually say, oh, the Lord's been really teaching me XYZ, or wow, I really felt convicted about, or the thing that I'm starting to realize, like, to go to a place that takes something deeper will both take that relationship deeper and also bring about conversations that are more meaningful for them and for you.
And you
right?
have levels of people in a business. Like, there are people that know me way better, that are closer to me because, we have regular meetings and they report to me, etc. And then there's people further down the line but I still, like, I'm an open book because I believe that as they move along the path towards wholeness and healing, that everything about their life will be better. So I want to help. Part of my responsibility as a leader is to lead a life that's worthy of emulation. Like, from my earliest days, I felt like that's who I need to be, to lead a life worthy of other people. Like, be an example, just be an example. That's so. And I'm even now as I'm talking it, like, God's called me to higher and higher levels of that in successive periods of my life. This obedience that I just talked about, like, gotta get better. Could people
Well,
follow your lead and live a thriving life if they're speeding and driving recklessly, which I would never say about myself, but other people might say about me? Then that's probably not a model to follow.
well, I think too, like, what is the model or what's the example? It's transparency, humility, willing to be wrong, willing to be like, it's like this, it's not a let me put myself on a shelf so that everyone thinks I'm really great. It's actually this very humbling, self-exposing sort of process. And so that's an ethic of the kingdom in itself. I'm going to demonstrate a self-sacrificial life by not making myself too high or I'm not going to glorify myself. I'm going to be self-sacrificial in that way.
Well, and I just thought of the passage in Hebrews where he talks about your elders are going to have to give an account for how they led you. And I think in that passage it's in the context of church. However, I think it would be wise for us as business leaders to consider, like, that this also applies to us. We should also take on that standard. So we have to give account for the people that are under our leadership. It's something to be mindful of.
You've given us a few examples, maybe short stories or examples of how this has shown up in your business. But I'd love to hear any other stories, either from relationships with people in your business or with clients or with the greater public. How has the Lord used your business or you and your business to proclaim the kingdom?
There's probably others that are going to remember stuff better. I'm often not a remembering person. I'm really good about thinking into the future, but pulling specific examples out of the past. I'm more about engineering the future. I mean, two things simply came to mind. I don't know if they're exactly an answer to the question, but our logo, I don't know. Yeah, I know you've seen it. Our logo it's a stylized version of an Armenian art, which I'm Armenian. In Armenian art, it's the eternity symbol. And we from the earliest days, I didn't want like a sorry if this is you or anyone listening, but like a cheesy Fiverr house for our logo. I wanted something that had some meaning and some depth. And so we picked that. And even on articles of clothing, I always try to make sure that that's on the kind of on the left side of the sternum so that it's eternity is on our hearts as a reminder that everyone we deal with and everyone we work with is an eternal being. One of the things I want to do is put a bunch of quotes up on our wall. There's a specific wall that I'm thinking of, and we just haven't gotten to it yet, of just reminders of things like that. Like, God's put eternity in our hearts, and everyone we deal with is an eternal being. So that was one example. And then I just think we've always had a giving arm to what we do. And in some sense, that's kind of normalized in our culture for the biggest of companies, especially in our real estate space. And in the other sense, I wanted to make sure that our people are continuing. And so I'll have people from nonprofits come in and speak so that our people, even though they have some financial opportunity, that they still are cognizant of the needs of the greater community and some of the good work being done. So that's been a part of who we are. Also, our office is in an area where there's a good, not a good, yeah, a good amount of homeless traffic because there's 2 or 3 shelters within a mile of us, and so being kind to those folks, and there's even opportunity there where we could, who knows if we can take that kindness up a notch and what else we could do. So those are some ways. I wish I had some more concrete and some better examples for you for your question.
Yeah, no worries. What about opposition? Where have you experienced opposition, either in the marketplace or from employees or other people? Like, obviously, some people who are workers inside of a company feel more opposition because they could lose their job. But where have you maybe had to make sacrifices or experienced where somebody's it seems like they're persecuting you for taking a stand for the Lord?
I haven't had to deal with that very much. I got uh, I got an HR violation letter one time from a girl that thought that she didn't get the job because she didn't follow a certain set of religious beliefs, and our attorney handled it really quickly. But I haven't really run across a lot of opposition. And maybe that means
That's great.
I'm not doing enough, or maybe that means I'm just living in a town that's the buckle of the Bible Belt.
Yeah, maybe. And then the other question I was going to ask you is, okay, so we asked about like, okay, people that want to make a shift in their business is not currently going this way but they want to go the other way. But I'm just curious, what resources or what direction, what recommendations would you give to somebody that says, I feel this call to be more integrated with my faith and my work? What steps would you encourage them to take?
So 3 points. One would be reading, one would be community, and then one would be deep internal work, which would include other reading. The first reading would be focused on, hey, how do people think about this? And there's probably 3 or 4 titles I'd recommend in there. That's one. Number 2 is to find community and flesh these thoughts out with people, both locally and nationally. And then number 3 would be, you got to do some internal work, because if it's not already flowing out of you, like that's something that bears examination. Or forgiving, renouncing, because when Jesus called people, he didn't call people to like, hey, if you believe this. No, he said, come follow me. And that meant leaving everything behind and following him, living his pattern of life. So let's read the Gospels and say, what's the patterns? What are the things that Jesus does? How do I become more like him? How do I be with him, become more like him so I can do the things he does? And I think that at the end of the day, he would be the best example, or Paul or whatever following on, like the best example of what the kingdom is supposed to look like, what the kingdom brings. And I think getting clean is the first step. I think baptism has a picture of that, stepping into the water and getting all the gunk off. What is the gunk that you've accumulated from years on your journey that you need to scrub off? And that unforgiveness, bitterness, wrong beliefs. There's probably ways in which, I don't want to assume anything for anybody, but like what are the things we believe about God and don't like about him? Like, let's come clean with that. Be honest with him.
That's good. Go back to the practical resources for a second. What books, what podcasts, what resources would you recommend for someone to think about business, work, and the kingdom?
I think the two important books that I've read on this kingdom business, it's funny because way early on in my life, I read R.G. Letourneau. If you've heard of Letourneau University, it's there in Texas. But the founder of that university was like my first kind of like foray into thinking kingdom business. But I wouldn't say that would be one of my top ones, but it's a really good one. In fact, it'd be interesting to read it again because I think he saw some supernatural works as well that we kind of, in our culture, discount, or a lot of people discount. But the two most important books would be a book, Every Good Endeavor by Tim Keller, and then what we've already mentioned by Van Duzer, Why Business Matters to God. I think those would be the two most important books to read on this topic of business's mission as a starting point.
Every Good
Endeavor and Why Business Matters to God.
Yeah, Every Good Endeavor by Tim Keller is a great one. I remember that was one of the first ones I read. Why Business Matters to God was another great one. And then, Letourneau, you mentioned that one. Okay, cool. Any other thoughts, stories, recommendations, any free form encouragements you want to give to our audience?
Yeah, I think, what another resource I would say is Practicing the Way, that book, and then there's a website and there's a whole set of practices, but looking for the practices that Jesus had in his life, beginning to incorporate those into our lives. I want to give a shout out to the concept of Sabbath. We see that in Genesis 1 and 2. We see that later in Exodus, in the Ten Commandments and Deuteronomy, and it's largely forgotten nowadays. And I think a lot of churches and modern theology just kind of just puts it under the rug and just doesn't talk about it. Yet I think it can be a really life-giving practice, and I think it can really inform in the world of 24/7 on this Sabbath and a cessation of work. And for me, that means putting away my phone has become a really healthy ritual and habit in our lives. And I would recommend that for any business owner, anyone that's in a business, that you're an employee, basically everyone. It's just a reminder, and it's resistance against this world system that we are not our work. We're made in the image of God, and we will follow that model. He will provide. He's the provider. We don't have to provide. We do work. Work is beautiful. It's commanded, but also the model is there and the command is there that we cease from our labors.
Well, I think that's where we'll end. And I think our audience will be encouraged because they can see too that Christ is at work and he's with you. He's encouraging you. So thank you for being on the show, and appreciate you giving some insight. And we'll have to hear more about how this develops over the next year or two and have you back sometime.
Yeah, man. Thank you for having me on, and God bless you.
Be encouraged because Christ is at work in you, through you, and with you too. Hey, Kingdom Workers, don't forget to subscribe to our show on your podcast player. And like every other podcast, we would love a review on Apple Podcasts. But most importantly, will you share this episode with several friends who need to hear it? I've found the most powerful and interesting podcasts are recommendations from friends. So please share the link to this episode with 2 or 3 of them now. We appreciate you so much.